Picture this. September 30, 2022. A 34-year-old army captain, Ibrahim Traoré, storms the headlines after ousting Burkina Faso's then military ruler, Damiba. Yes, you heard right. This wasn't even a coup against a civilian president. It was a coup on top of a coup, like a political layer cake nobody ordered. His justification? The same one Damiba used. We'll beat terrorism and restore order. But Traoré added extra seasoning, promising elections in a year and peace in 6 months. Sounds bold, sounds heroic, almost like Netflix's next blockbuster script. Here's the problem. Those promises aged like milk in the sun. 6 months later, terrorism hadn't evaporated. A year later, democracy was still not a priority. Instead of ballots, Burkina Faso got more military uniforms in government chairs. Traoré insisted this wasn't betrayal, but practical focus. That's like promising you'll clean your house by spring and instead torching it because vacuuming was not a priority. But this moment matters because it shows how Traoré crafted his opening act. Big pledges, wrapped in urgency, framed as salvation. And let's be fair, in a country battered by jihadist violence and 2 coups in less than a year, people wanted to believe. Traoré wasn't just another officer with a gun. He was young, fresh, and compared to old, gray politicians, almost electric. This is the origin story of his hero label. The captain turned president cast himself as the anti-elite savior, standing against complacency. But here's the catch. When you set the bar sky high with promises of quick victories, the fall is just as dramatic when reality refuses to play along. If Traoré's coup was the opening act, his foreign policy was the big drum solo. Loud, dramatic, and guaranteed to make headlines. The first major move? Giving France the boot. That's right. In January 2023, he ordered French troops to pack up and leave. For decades, France had been Burkina Faso's security partner. But Traoré played the breakup like a teenager slamming the door after a bad date. And just like that, centuries of colonial baggage were kicked to the curb. But he didn't stop there. He tore up Burkina Faso's membership card with ECOWAS and the G5 Sahel, alliances designed to coordinate regional stability. Instead, Traoré went full new squad mode, joining hands with Mali and Niger, 2 other countries under military juntas. Together, they created the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, essentially a neighborhood watch where everyone wears camouflage. It was like dropping out of the PTA and starting your own parent club with matching uniforms and a chip on your shoulder. And then came the wild card, Russia. Traoré welcomed Moscow as a strategic partner, shaking hands with Putin, aligning politically, and opening the door to security cooperation. For his supporters, this was sovereignty in action. Ditch the old colonial overlord, embrace new friendships, chart your own path. For critics, it was swapping one dependency for another, and with Russia embroiled in global controversies, the optics weren't exactly sunshine and roses. Still, this bold pivot reinforced Traoré's pan-African, anti-Western brand. Online, he looked like a revolutionary David standing up to Goliath. At home, though, it raised the question, if the new friends don't solve the terror crisis, was the breakup worth it? Now let's talk about life inside Burkina Faso under Traoré, because while he's fist-bumping Putin abroad, things at home are tightening faster than a jar lid after grandma's had a go at it. Once in power, Traoré wasted no time consolidating control. He reshuffled the military, packed key posts with loyalists, and made it very clear, dissent is not welcome. Independent journalists? Their job just got harder. Reports of terrorist attacks are carefully managed, which is a polite way of saying downplayed, censored, or buried. Opposition voices? Silenced, intimidated, or pushed aside. Political parties can exist, technically, but they're like decorative plants. You see them, but they're not doing much growing. And if you dare to criticize the president too loudly, guess what?
Under a new law, the government can literally strip you of your Burkinabe citizenship. Yes, you can be ghosted by your own country. This is the paradox of Traoré. He rose to power promising democracy, then declared elections not a priority. It's like hiring a babysitter who swears they'll read the kids' bedtime stories, then locks the books in the closet and says, "Reading isn't a priority tonight." Supporters argue that strong measures are necessary during wartime, that unity means silencing division. But critics see a pattern, a leader who uses crisis as a permanent excuse. And here's the kicker. Every clampdown chips away at the very freedoms people thought they'd eventually regain once the chaos ended. Instead of being temporary, the emergency feels permanent. And if you think civil liberties are under pressure, wait until you see how Traoré took a red pen to the nation's social fabric, rewriting laws and criminalizing lives in ways that shocked the world. If you thought stripping citizenship was harsh, buckle up, because Traoré's government recently turned social policy into a battlefield. In September 2025, Burkina Faso passed a sweeping amendment to its family code that made same-sex relationships a criminal offense for the first time in the country's history. Penalty? 2 to 5 years in prison plus fines. That's right, consenting adults behind closed doors now face jail time for who they love. This move stunned many observers because, unlike several African nations, Burkina Faso hadn't inherited colonial-era anti-sodomy laws. For decades, it was one of the few countries on the continent where homosexuality wasn't illegal. Traoré flipped that script, pushing the country backwards into criminalization. Human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch called it a violation of equality and dignity. Supporters of the law, however, framed it as protecting cultural values and severing ties with Western influence. Translation, sovereignty dressed up as repression. And it didn't stop there. The same legal package gave the government more sweeping powers, including the right to strip citizenship from individuals who publicly criticize the president or his regime. Imagine losing not only your right to vote, but your entire nationality. All because you posted the wrong thing online. That's not law and order, that's control on steroids. So what's the takeaway here? Traoré isn't just consolidating military and political power, he's reshaping the moral and legal identity of Burkina Faso itself. By criminalizing same-sex relationships and silencing dissent, he's binding sovereignty to authoritarianism. It's a high-stakes gamble that appeals to conservative supporters, but alienates rights defenders at home and abroad. But here's the twist. While critics are pointing out these crackdowns, Traoré's image online tells a totally different story, one where he's not the villain, but the revolutionary hero Africa's been waiting for. Now here's where things get really surreal. Offline, Traoré is clamping down on freedoms, rewriting laws, and struggling against jihadists. But online, he's basically Africa's Che Guevara with Wi-Fi. Scroll through Facebook pages like Traoré Vision or Traoré Builds Africa, and you'll see a curated image of a charismatic young leader, standing tall, shocking the West, and plotting at secret master plan to make Burkina Faso a pan-African powerhouse. Supporters flood TikTok and Twitter with clips of him railing against France, posing with soldiers, or shaking hands with Putin. He's framed as the fearless revolutionary, the modern reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, the iconic Burkinabe reader assassinated in the 1980s. For young Africans disillusioned with complacent, aging politicians, Traoré's swagger and rhetoric feel refreshing, even electrifying. He's 37, not 70, and that alone makes him stand out. But here's the catch. Much of this is deliberate media engineering. Exiled journalists like Justin Yarga point out that propaganda campaigns are carefully orchestrated to distract from failures at home, particularly the unfulfilled promise of security. Videos highlight bold speeches, not the villages overrun by militants. Memes showcase defiance against France, not the fact that over 2/3 of Burkina Faso's land is outside government control. It's not fake news, exactly. It's selective storytelling, and it works. For his critics, this digital stardom is smoke and mirrors, masking repression with revolutionary aesthetics. But for his fans, the online image is enough. Even if it's propaganda, they say, at least he's right about France. And speaking of France, security was Traoré's original selling point. So has all this posturing actually made Burkina Faso safer? Spoiler alert, the answer isn't the victory speech he promised. Security wasn't just part of Traoré's sales pitch, it was the whole billboard. Remember his bold promise? 6 months to defeat extremists, 1 year to stabilize the nation. That was the reason he toppled Damiba in the first place. Fast forward 3 years, and the picture looks grim. Attacks are still happening, communities are still under siege, and the country is bleeding territory faster than a leaky faucet. Take the Barcelogo massacre of August 2024, where hundreds of civilians were killed in one of the deadliest attacks in recent memory. Incidents like this undercut every ounce of Traoré's credibility. According to regional experts, roughly 70% of Burkina Faso is either under jihadist control or beyond effective government reach. That's not mission accomplished, that's mission abandoned. So, how does the regime handle this failure? With silence. Reports of attacks are often downplayed, casualties minimized, and coverage restricted. Instead of fighting terrorism on the battlefield, the government is fighting narratives in the media. But here's the problem. When villagers are displaced, families lose loved ones, and entire towns become ghost zones, no amount of spin can hide reality. Supporters argue that alliances with Mali, Niger, and Russia are long-term plays that will eventually turn the tide. Critics counter that swapping allies hasn't changed the math on the ground. Militants are stronger, the state is weaker, and ordinary Burkinabe are paying the price. Bottom line, security was supposed to be Traoré's crowning achievement. Instead, it's his Achilles heel, the glaring hole in his armor that no speech, handshake, or social media post can patch. And while the bullets fly, the laws keep tightening. Let's look at how Traoré's legal reforms are reshaping daily life in ways that reach far beyond the battlefield. If you thought Traoré's policies were only about soldiers and security, think again. He's also been busy with his pen, rewriting the legal DNA of Burkina Faso. The September 2025 family code reforms were headline-grabbing for criminalizing homosexuality, but that wasn't the only shift. The law also handed the government sweeping new powers to define who belongs and who doesn't. One clause allows the state to revoke Burkinabe citizenship from individuals accused of acting against national interests. Sounds vague? That's the point. It could mean journalists exposing corruption, activists criticizing military strategy, or even ordinary citizens posting sharp comments on Facebook. Overnight, people can go from citizens to stateless, stripped of rights with a single stroke of bureaucratic ink. It's like an HOA on steroids. Break the rules, lose not just your mailbox privileges, but your entire address on the map. Another element? Expanded powers to police morality. Officials frame this as protecting cultural sovereignty, but critics see it as a backdoor to curtail freedom of speech, association, and identity. Add this to the ban on same-sex relationships, and you've got a society where conformity is legally enforced. These reforms reveal a strategy. Traoré isn't just running the state, he's redefining its boundaries. Supporters call it strength, a necessary consolidation to protect sovereignty. Detractors call it authoritarian creep, dressed in the language of culture and nationalism. Either way, the family code has become more than law. It's a litmus test for whether Burkina Faso is moving towards sovereignty or sliding into repression.
Walk through the streets of Ouagadougou, and you'll hear two very different conversations about Traore. On one side, you have the supporters, the young, the disillusioned, the people tired of old elites who seemed more interested in polished speeches than real change. For them, Traore's anti-French rhetoric, his alliance with fellow juntas, and his bold, youthful image strike a powerful chord. He feels like the leader who finally told the former colonizers, "We're done here." That defiance, in their eyes, makes him a hero. But then whisper a little quieter, and you'll find the other side. Activists, journalists, LGBTQ citizens, political dissidents. These people don't see a hero, they see a ruler tightening the noose. They live in fear of surveillance, censorship, or arbitrary punishment. Some describe self-censoring their conversations, avoiding political topics, even with friends. Others talk about the chilling effect of knowing that criticizing the government could cost them not just their freedom, but their citizenship. This duality is what makes Traore's regime so complex. It isn't black and white. It's a messy gray. For many ordinary Burkinabe, especially those far from the capital, what matters most is security. If their village is overrun by militants, they don't care about rhetoric. They want results. And here, Traore's provinces remain thin. But in the capital, and online, the image of defiance and sovereignty continues to inspire. So, is he a savior or a tyrant? The truth depends on who you ask, and whether they feel safe enough to answer honestly. And while the streets of Burkina Faso tell one story, the world beyond its borders tells another. Let's explore how Traore's reputation is being shaped internationally and why some hail him as Africa's new icon. Step outside Burkina Faso, and Traore's reputation shifts yet again. On the global stage, he's often painted as the new face of pan-African defiance, the young revolutionary standing up to France and shaking the table of international politics. For many across Africa, particularly disillusioned youth scrolling through TikTok and Twitter, Traore looks like the leader who finally said out loud what others only whispered. Africa doesn't need colonial babysitters anymore. That message travels well, and it resonates far beyond Ouagadougou. Some analysts even compare him to Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's legendary 1980s leader who embodied radical independence before being assassinated. Traore borrows from Sankara's imagery: military uniform, fiery speeches, rejection of French dominance, creating a narrative of continuity. In Pan-African circles, this makes him magnetic. The underdog who stares down Western powers and claims sovereignty on his own terms. But the flip side? International rights groups and foreign governments see a different story. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN have criticized his clampdowns on press freedom, the criminalization of homosexuality, and laws that allow citizenship to be stripped away. To them, Traore isn't a liberator. He's another strongman in camouflage, wielding repression under the banner of sovereignty. This dual reputation creates tension. Supporters outside Burkina Faso amplify his heroic narrative, while watchdogs and foreign diplomats warn of rising authoritarianism. And somewhere in the middle, ordinary Burkinabe are stuck with both the myth and the reality. So, internationally, is Traore the savior of Pan-Africanism or just another autocrat with good PR? The answer, much like at home, depends entirely on which lens you're looking through. And that brings us to the big question. What comes next? Because revolutions and regimes alike run on promises, and Traore's future will hinge on whether he can deliver or collapse under his own contradictions. So, what does Traore's story teach us?
On one hand, he's the embodiment of defiance. Young, bold, and unafraid to kick out France, shake hands with Russia, and preach sovereignty to cheering crowds. On the other hand, he's consolidating power, criminalizing identities, and leaving promises of security unfulfilled. Hero to some, autocrat to others. The title really fits. The future of his rule hinges on three fragile pillars: security, legitimacy, and public patience. If terrorism continues to spread, no amount of fiery speeches or slick social media campaigns can hide the fact that ordinary Burkinabe aren't safer. Without safety, support risks crumbling, even among his most loyal followers. Legitimacy is another problem. Traore promised elections, then shelved them. At some point, people will start asking, is this revolution permanent, or is democracy ever coming back? Internationally, the balancing act gets even trickier. His pan-African stance wins applause online, but growing human rights criticisms could isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically. Aligning too tightly with Russia may also create dependency, undermining the very sovereignty he claims to defend. The lesson here is simple. Revolutionary charisma can spark hope, but sustaining it requires results. Sankara became a legend not just because of his defiance, but because he transformed society in tangible ways. Traore's test will be whether he can move beyond rhetoric into real change, or whether history will remember him as another strongman whose promises dissolved in fear and failure. For now, his image glitters online, his speeches electrify some, and his clampdowns terrify others. But as every ruler learns, myth only lasts until reality catches up. So what do you think? Is Traore Africa's new hope, or just another uniformed autocrat? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe for more deep dives where power meets reality.